I'm Evan Attwood from Fandom Workshop.
And I'm Daniel Sullivan, the director of Fandom Workshop.
And we're here to talk at your ears so you don't have to go through the pain and torment of not listening to us.
That's right, after a 15-hour shouting competition, we are back and better than ever.
Our voices are as robust and sensual as ever.
And anytime anyone asks me about my voice, I always describe it as robust.
Mm-hmm.
Today we're talking about reboots, which is something that we talk about a lot already. But reboots have been a element of film that has gotten pretty popular in the last 15 to 20 years.
Yeah, reboots, remakes, reimaginings,
Retelling.
re-envisionings, retellings. All of these are, I think, excellent ways to bring a franchise kind of back to life, reinvigorate it, and bring in new viewership. And we've been seeing that a lot with movies, like you were saying, just over the past 15, 20 years.
Some good, some not as much, and some just kind of blandly lacking in purpose. But one of the things we should talk about is what constitutes a reboot. And even though it's a little bit of a gray area, that's mainly where we're going to stay. Reboot, most of the time, means rebooting a franchise.
Yeah, I mean, overall, it's a really gray area in any regard. But some things are more clearly reboots of franchises than others.
Typically, when you're using the word re-envisioning, though, that usually tends to be not limited, but tends to mostly mean when a film has crossed the international date line. And I don't mean that as a metaphor or anything, like literally crossed the international date line. Abre Los Ojos crossed the seas to become Vanilla Sky.
Yeah, and then we had Old Boy come out last year. All these movies weren't terribly old, or lacking in any, technological aspects, but
just doing it again.
They're just doing it again, but bringing it over to the U.S. To get an additional viewership.
And we seem to be doing that a lot now with British television.
That'll happen a lot too. Yeah,
we see it, we like it, we do it again.
Mm-hmm.
And
we do a couple extra seasons of The Office.
One of the things I just found out, and there is almost no footage of it available, but you can find some imagery of it. They did an American version of the IT Crowd.
Really?
I think it just exploded in front of a test audience, and I mean that in a negative way.
Oh, wow.
But it was Joel McHale.
Huh.
Playing Chris O'Dowd's role, and the guy who played Moss, Richard Ayoade.
Not 100% sure.
Anyway, he played Moss.
Okay.
So he actually carried over. But they found some footage of it, and I saw it, and it was so strange how they just kind of traded some of the lines out. It was this terrible, terrible imitation.
Weird.
Yeah.
But anyway, back on the topic of movie reboots. One of the things I like to think about is the Superman reboot, reimagining, because it kind of takes a lot of those different elements all into one. When we got Superman Returns with Brandon Routh, that was a reboot of a franchise, but it was continuing off of the first two Superman movies with Christopher Reeve.
When you're recasting and staying in the same continuity, I don't think that's no longer a reboot. It's like a kick in the ass.
Well, yeah, that's what I'm saying. It's rebooting the franchise and trying to bring in more viewership for new Superman movies, and it also took over the continuity of the movies that happened after those first two. So what we were left was it was a reboot of a franchise partway through. So again, gray area.
And that's also that was directed by Bryan Singer, and it's also kind of a Bryan Singer thing, which is if he's going to tell a story, even if it's his own, even if he did the movie that came before it, if he didn't like something about the other one, he'll just go ahead and gloss right over it.
Yeah.
Which, it's funny when you think about it. X-Men Days of Future Past was that also the same idea of rebooting without getting out of the continuity.
They rebooted themselves.
Which is also, and then that has also expanded outward into other ideas. The other movies have done that as well. The Star Trek reboot did the whole idea of continuing the continuity and then segueing into the alternate reality, which is the Chris Pine, Zachary Quinto.
And they're giving us fantastic movies. And again, it's a reboot of a franchise, but it's a re-envisioning of a story. It's unique into itself, but it's using themes and characters that we're already familiar with.
Right. And also, what was interesting about Superman Returns is that it maintains the same continuity of the Richard Donner films while also taking the liberty of the floating timeline that we often see in comics. Because Peter
Yes.
Parker, by floating timeline, I mean how characters seem somewhat ageless. Because Peter Parker stayed in college way too
Yeah, well,
long, taking liberties with the floating timeline.
and that's his lot in life. He is perpetually going to be in that awkward adolescent stage.
Yep.
Now, we did also recently watch a couple of reboots that came out, Dread, and
Dread.
then we also watched RoboCop that
Yep.
came out a while back. And again, these are reboots, but they're different. They take into account a lot of new aspects or retellings of the previous stories. RoboCop obviously took a lot of the aesthetic elements that made RoboCop what it was, and we now had more technological advancement to make I think a cleaner, more visually appealing sci-fi film. But it did take some liberties when we're talking about the themes and character development.
I think that you bring up an interesting point with RoboCop because when that came out, people either liked it, hated it. Some people just didn't care. I am a huge fan of the first film. Paul Verhoeven did this great, satirically violent film that was just a wonderful, wonderful piece that stands on its own. And it is very clearly from a time period, but it also makes no efforts to seem ageless at all. So it really kind of fits on its own. The RoboCop reboot, I really enjoyed on a lot of levels. One of the things
I did too.
One of the things that it did so well was, and I'm not sure if this was, I can never figure out exactly what the studio was thinking here, because what they did for this was they seemed to pretty much buy the exact same ingredients that made the first one such a hit. They got foreign director Jose Padilla, who had never really had a big American hit before. Same thing with Paul Verhoeven. He had never done an American film. In fact, actually, when they did that, Paul Verhoeven still didn't speak very good English, so they had to have a translator on set quite a bit.
Oh wow, I did not know that.
And then also, Paul Verhoeven was so hell-bent on telling his own story. It was violent, it was bloody, it was all the themes of Verhoeven. If you watch any of his previous films, you can see that kind of theme that he has. Everything, all of his tropes are used in RoboCop. Same thing with Padilla. With his version of it, he wanted to tell his own story using the RoboCop vessel, which it's amazing how well it actually worked. The only problem is that the reboot was PG-13, which I'm not saying that I need gratuitous violence, but it's a story that serves well with a certain amount of gratuitous violence and gratuitous sex. And you felt at times that it was being inhibited.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of times when studios are trying to, lighten up the ratings, they have to avoid doing certain things. And in a franchise like RoboCop, you almost need a little bit more of that violence visible to justify the reasons for having all of these advancements in technology, trying to keep the peace, the creation of RoboCop himself.
Well, and also too, one of the things that made RoboCop the original so iconic is that his Alex Murphy's original execution. That was another thing too that I had forgotten. One of those elements as well was using more well-established actors to play the corporate heads, and then lesser-known actors to play the leads. They did that in the first one. They did it in this one too.
Yeah.
But the original death of Alex Murphy in the first one was brutal. It's painful to watch. It's disturbing as all get out. And that's one of the things that made that so impacting. And that's one of Verhoeven's big things is he loves crucifixion, he loves the whole rebirth and everything. And he loves doing the Jesus
paradigm.
Yeah. And so with this, the death of Murphy was still impacting, but it was not nearly, it didn't have the lasting effect.
Yeah. Now, RoboCop aside and moving on to some more gratuitous violence, Dread.
Now let's turn that everything we just talked about RoboCop 1 to the other. Let's turn that actually around.
Yeah, flip it back on its ear. We had an original Judge Dredd
Sylvester Stallone.
with Sylvester Stallone.
And this one actually has source material. This is based off of the comic book 2000 AD.
Exactly. Now, the original Judge Dredd movie with Stallone that we saw was campy.
Awful.
It was campy and not very good, in my opinion, for many reasons. There was a lot of attempt to insert unnecessary humor in what should have been a very gritty environment.
That's the thing, is that with Judge Dredd, and they did it so well in the comic books, and it was lost in the 90s version of the movie, is that to do this, you have to sell the idea of a dystopian future. You have to sell the brutality because you have to justify martial law.
Yeah, you have to justify consistent martial law with the idea of these judges being, judge, jury, and executioner all in one.
And that's one of the things that didn't work. So many things didn't work in the original 90s version. But the visuals were bleak, but everyone had a certain amount of humanity that, it can only come from a screenwriter figuring out how to advance a plot.
Yeah. And now with the reboot, which was probably one of the most visually stunning independent films I've ever seen.
And just a damn amazing movie. If you haven't seen it, hop on your Netflix and go check it out.
But again, warning, there is a gratuitous amount of violence.
Oh, it is a brutal, brutal film. And one of the things that they do so well to show that amount of gratuity is gratuity, like they were tipped.
Gratuitous
violence.
Yep.
Is that it's often a side note. If you keep looking in the corner of the film, half the time, the things you see so quickly are just incredibly disturbing, but also nobody's reacting to them. And that's one of the things that made that movie so good.
And it sold a dystopian future where, people understood and accepted the necessity of the judges. Now, one of the elements that I really liked was they kept a lot closer to the original source material. The character of Judge Dredd, they actually didn't show his face.
Perfect thing. And also, one of the things they did so well in this movie, and with a lesser cast, it would have been a crash and burn, is there is no real connecting moments between characters.
No.
Because the movie maintains a certain sense of urgency that justifies a distance between all the characters, and it's done so well.
The entire movie it takes place over one night.
One night, yeah.
And it's a trial by fire.
And also, what's great about that is that Judge Dredd is not the main character.
Nope.
He is more. What's great is that you see him through the eyes of a rookie cop, which makes him this very monolithic figure.
Which is always what he was supposed to be. I mean, Judge Dredd, in the context of the comics and in the movie Dredd, was an avatar for the theme of justice.
And the original one with Sylvester Stallone was during the 90s, where it was just kind of a money-making idea. And also, too, comic book movies were not taken seriously. It was done as a visual fanfare that was just kind of meh.
Meh. Now, speaking of some franchises that I did not think were meh, we had a pretty significant reboot of the Spider-Man franchise. We had
which I think came the closest to the wire between any reboot ever. I mean, we barely waited till the body was cold from the Sam Raimi trilogy.
Yeah, and one of the reasons for that is one of the other reasons we wanted to talk to you about reboots is that one of the reasons we have so many reboots is often studios will be about to lose the rights, the film rights,
without producing content.
Exactly. So in the with Sony Pictures, they had made the Sam Raimi trilogy, and it had been long enough that the rights were about to expire and go back to Marvel, who by this point now had their own production studio. So I'm sure they were really excited to hopefully get those. But Sony Pictures did go out and make some new movies. They made Amazing Spider-Man and Amazing Spider-Man 2.
Directed by Mark Webb.
Now, often I think of the idea of, production companies making movies specifically to retain the rights, possibly being a little underhanded, and often it can produce very poor content.
Oh, and it's
However,
also kind of a dick move sometimes.
yeah, but however, in the case of Amazing Spider-Man and Amazing Spider-Man 2, I loved those movies.
Mm,
I love them.
absolutely.
I love them so much. I think together, one and two, they form an amazing story arc. The whole coming of age story of Peter gaining responsibility, learning to be Spider-Man, and then learning the consequences of being Spider-Man.
Just the backbreaking consequences.
Oh God, now I'm gonna start crying.
I think also one of the things that's so valuable about that is that there was enough, even though this is kind of what you were talking about with the whole idea of retaining the rights, with this is coming right off the heels of Sam Raimi's trilogy, which was done during this time where we still weren't quite taking comic book movies seriously yet. And when I saw the original Sam Raimi trilogy, I remember it blew my goddamn mind. I was in love with it. And then as soon as we got past that and I look back on them, I realized I actually don't like them. Like, I really don't.
Now, I'm not a huge fan of them, especially now that I've seen some good examples of how Spider-Man can be some good versions of movies. But I mean, there were definitely elements that I really liked of the originals. Obviously, J. Jonah Jameson was perfect.
But that was the thing, is that he was so good. J.K. Simmons as Jameson was so amazing. But the problem is that he could only exist in that over cartoon universe that Sam Raimi created with that. So it's like, as much as I would like to see him all over the place playing that role, as much as I'd like to see him playing Jameson in the Mark Webb movies, you couldn't.
I would still love it. I won't concede defeat on that one. I still think that J.K. Simmons should always and forever be the quintessential J. Jonah Jameson. But anyway, other than that, I mean, there were some amazing elements. I think reimagining.
Gary Oldman should be Jameson.
Gary Oldman should be everything. He can be everyone, and probably is everyone.
As it turns out, we are Gary Oldman right now.
We are both Gary Oldman.
And
right
you
now.
at home are Gary Oldman as well.
You're doing a very good job at being you, Gary Oldman.
You listen to us, Gary Oldman, because we are Gary Oldman.
But anyway, Gary Oldman aside, we had some amazing performances, I think, in the case of Alfred Molina as Doc Ock in the second one. I thought that he was a great choice. And
Stifled by bad writing, though.
A little bit, but I think he brought some amazing character arc to a persona, usually very, very divided.
I agree, and I think Alfred Molina was absolutely awesome. The only problem is that I felt like everyone in that movie was stifled by two-dimensional writing.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I also liked was Sandman in the third one, but that was the only thing I liked. I wanted to see an entire movie about Sandman, and they gave me some anecdotal sequences of him and nothing else.
Yep, no, that was bad. And now, stepping outside the comic book realm, one of the things that was so interesting about the reboot genre is when you actually have a really hard time defining it, like with one of my favorites, James Bond.
Oh, here we go. Dan's gonna talk about James Bond for 8 minutes.
Well, you were talking about Spider-Man. I had started drinking, so I'm getting talky.
Good.
James Bond is one of my favorites, absolute favorites. The books, the movies, and he's also one of the few characters who's kind of a Time Lord, because he's also
the character's always perpetually played by different actors.
Perpetually played by different actors and maintains the same history. In which, most of the time you will never see his driver's license or anything of when he was born, because they somehow have always kind of maintained that everything that has happened.
Yeah, they just have it in a sense of timeless always.
However, this last round of Bond, starring Daniel Craig, has officially rebooted the series by making the one movie that had never been made as part of the canon from the first actual Bond book, Casino Royale.
Yep.
And if you haven't seen it, you haven't seen Shakespeare the way it was intended.
Played only by men for a crowd of drunken morons.
And whooping cough was a problem.
True.
Sorry, that's how Shakespeare's
in the Globe Theater.
Yep.
I went there once.
But Daniel Craig's portrayal of James Bond is the first time I've ever seen it done how I feel it was intended from the writing. It is so perfect.
No, I agree. I liked the idea of Bond being a more rough and tumble character rather than just being able to talk his way out of any situation. You had a Bond that seemed like he could get out of the worst situations because he had already been in the worst of situations.
And that was also one of the great things that they've done in this series of the Craig series as well, is that the situations that he clearly hasn't been in, he is staring death in the face and couldn't be happier because he is a blithering nut job. And
Yeah.
that is one of the things they do so well with this one, is that his charming demeanor is supposed to be a little bit scary. And that's the thing, is that this is a clear sociopath, and now for the first time we're actually seeing it portrayed that way.
Yep.
With that too, you also have a problem of a lot of people feeling pretty negatively about reboots sometimes, and usually that argument is, don't fuck with the original.
Mm-hmm.
And I tend to dislike that. Now, mind you, reboots have been bad. They have been bad before. Like,
we're getting good ones now, but there is a long track record of them not being super great.
Also, too, do you remember the shot-for-shot remake of Psycho?
Yeah.
What was the point? I mean, it was interesting to see Viggo Mortensen play the role of the boyfriend and see Vince Vaughn play the role of Norman Bates, but why? Nothing was offered from that. It was a shot-for-shot remake.
And it was almost like saying that Alfred Hitchcock was a bad filmmaker to begin with.
Yeah. However, one of the things...
not the case.
One of the things that bothers me, though, is when people just object by saying, you know what, there's only one James Bond and it's Sean Connery. Or like when the new Mad Max trailer came out, people said there's only one Mad Max and it's Mel Gibson. That is not being faithful to the original. That is just holding on to what you have a memory of without wanting to experience anything new.
And that's fine. I mean, when you have reboots, you don't necessarily need to like the new ones. You'll still always have the originals, and if those are near and dear to your heart, you'll always have them. The remakes might not necessarily be for you, but for a new audience able to enjoy something based on or similar to a property that you've always loved and enjoyed. And I think that gives us all a little bit of common ground.
I am so much more negative than you.
That can be the case sometimes.
My mind is like Thunderdome. 2 movies enter, 1 movie leaves. 3:10 to Yuma was made originally. It wasn't that great. 3:10 to Yuma was made with Christian Bale and Russell Crowe, and it was awesome.
And I just want all our movies to sit down, have a nice spot of tea, and some pleasant conversation.
So we need sentient films first.
And on that potentially horrifying note, thank you so much for listening. I'm Evan Attwood of Fandom Workshop.
And I'm Daniel Sullivan of Ford Motors.
Thank you again for listening. Please be sure to check out Fandom Workshop on North Bay TV and online.
YouTube. Check out our Instagram, Facebook, and our Twitter. Drop us a line at fandomworkshop@gmail.com. Let us know what you're a fan of. Send us some pics.
Send us cool things.
Of your fan stuff, preferably.
Yeah. Just say hi. Say hi to us. We like it.
And
we enjoy the good times.
Evan, during this podcast, drew a great picture of Pickle.
Yep, it's a little pickle. He's a reboot of Mr. Peanut, but he's a pickle with a top hat and a monocle.
And much edgier than the original.
Hello, boys. Looks like you got into yourself a bit of a pickle. What deal do you think of next? Goodbye.
Bye.